Hey, it is Thursday, May 21st, 2026, and this is the first episode of the Curb Appeal podcast. This isn't going to be a podcast about interest rates, square footage, and contracts. Sometimes we'll talk about real estate, sometimes we'll talk about business, and sometimes we'll just talk about life. Today, I want to share my story about how I almost quit real estate if it wasn't for a random coincidence that changed everything. So I officially became a realtor almost a year ago. And at first I was really motivated. I was so excited that I passed my classes, I passed my test, and I signed with Keller Williams. And next I expected a little hands-on guidance about what I should do. But what really happened was I got access to their CRM, I got access to a couple of different logins to places, which was cool. But I really didn't know how to organize leads. I didn't know how to market myself. I didn't even know how to use the CRM. I didn't even know what I should be doing every day. I did have a couple of Google Meets with a guy who was genuinely nice, and he really wanted to help. But sometimes I left those meetings still feeling lost. Not because anybody was mean, not because anybody did anything wrong. I just needed a little more hands-on guidance. Month after month, my wife and I watched money leave our bank account, about $100 a month, and I wasn't really moving forward. My wife started asking a question that I was asking myself. What exactly are we paying for? And I didn't have a great answer. Now here's the part that I like to call serendipitous. I went to elementary school in a tiny town in Illinois called Pocahontas. My mom still delivers mail there. One day she was delivering a letter to a guy from Keller Williams, and they started talking about real estate. She mentioned how her son, myself, I'm a Keller Williams real estate agent in Kentucky. He explained he was no longer with Keller Williams and gave her a business card. Said, "Have your son call me. I'd love to talk about real estate with him." Now imagine that. A little conversation in a tiny town in Illinois, while I'm over here in Kentucky trying to figure everything out. Now here's the funny part. I didn't call him for 3 months. The card sat on my desk. 3 months. Because that's what we do whenever we're uncomfortable. We procrastinate. We overthink. We tell ourselves we'll do it tomorrow. Eventually, I did call him. We talked about real estate. We talked about business. We talked about some mutual people we know and how funny it is that we both grew up around a small town, but we had never met, but we had mutual connections. And he asked me a simple question. Had I looked at Real Broker? I said no. I thought it sounded interesting, but it wasn't enough for me to make a move. So I sat on that idea too. A few days later, he calls me back, and he says, "You're not going to believe this. I know an agent in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. Would you like to meet her?" I said, "Absolutely." Now keep in mind, I had been a licensed real estate agent for 9 months. 9 months. And I had never had a face-to-face meeting with an agent. Everything else had been virtual. Google Meets, Zoom calls, videos. This was the first time I was sitting across the table from another real estate agent. When we sat down for lunch, it was the moment that everything clicked. She started showing me the systems, and one of them was Reason. And I thought, finally, something that makes sense. Everything was organized. Every buyer, every seller, every transaction, everything had a place. And she asked me a question that I'll never forget. She said, "What kind of training have you had?" And I really didn't know how to answer because I really didn't have any training. And she said, "So you're telling me you've been paying Keller Williams $100 a month and you haven't had any training?" And I said no. And then she showed me Real Academy, daily live training, recorded training, entire libraries dedicated to new agents, marketing, lead generation, open houses, systems, everything organized, everything accessible. And I thought to myself, this is what I thought real estate was going to be when I got started. It was pretty much the next day I switched to Real Broker. And one of the first things I did was join the Mentorship program. Now I have somebody I can call, somebody invested in my success, somebody who's walked the path before, and can tell me whenever I'm headed in the wrong direction, and I don't have to find out the hard way myself. And then there's the business side. At Keller Williams, my split was 70-30. At Real, it's 85-15, and the cap is significantly lower. The technology stack just makes more sense. The training fits how I learn, and the mentorship solved one of my biggest problems. I no longer have to feel like I'm figuring out everything alone. But this episode isn't about brokerages. It's about something bigger. It's about asking for help. Because if I had never called that number, none of this happens. If there hadn't been a random conversation in a small Illinois town, none of this happens. If I hadn't said yes to lunch, none of this happens. Sometimes your next opportunity isn't hiding behind a grand plan. Sometimes it's hiding behind a conversation you've been putting off.